So you thought Jack the Ripper was a member of the British royal family or upper-class English Freemason, but no, he was an Irish-American, he was a Canadian, he was here in Toronto once before he went to Whitechapel and stalked the streets with murderous consequences. Francis Tumblety was born in Ireland, but his family emigrated to North America. They were part of an Irish diaspora located on both sides of the American-Canadian border, from Nova Scotia across the Great Lakes to Chicago. It's astonishing enough that Canada produced a candidate for Jack the Ripper, but this man, Francis Tumblety, was also implicated in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Sounds too fantastic to be true? Let me tell you all about it. Tumblety would be imprisoned in 1865 over the Lincoln assassination, and then nearly a quarter of a century later, in London, England, was accused of being Jack the Ripper. In Canada, earlier in his life, he also got into legal scrapes. Canada plays a central role in my theory about who was Jack the Ripper, because the person I think Jack the Ripper was spent a lot of his life here in Canada. And here in Toronto, he got very rich as a quack doctor selling what were termed patent medicines to society folk. It would have been hard to ignore Tumblety's office with an enormous pair of buckhorns over the door, and he claimed these had been given to him by a Native American chief, Chief Sundown. Now that story is often poo-pooed and seen as another of Tumblety's inventions. I think it may actually be true, because there actually was a Chief Sundown who was touring theatres in North America talking about the rituals and rites of the Mohawk and Penobscot tribes. And I think somebody like Tumblety would have gone to see another showman like Sundown at the theatre and maybe picked up those buckhorns directly from Chief Sundown himself, or picked them up in the equivalent of the theatre gift shop. Tumblety set up his dubious medical business in Toronto, Montreal and St. John, annoying local physicians with his claims to cure everything from cancer to pimples with herbal cures. He made some very powerful enemies and had to keep leaving one city after another. Some parts of Toronto, if you excuse the graffiti, haven't changed that much since Tumblety's days. And you can imagine him at night wandering the streets looking for young chaps to hire as his valets, because that's something that he did. He would get off basically with these young men, and then he would offer them a job with his business. Then it would all go horrendously wrong. The young men would rob him. It would end up in court. The young men would then say that Tumblety had molested them, and then the whole thing would be reported in the newspapers in very coded language. But everybody in Toronto, in Montreal, in St. John, who knew Tumblety, knew all about his sexuality, about his nighttime prowling for young men. He was absolutely notorious for it. He was, on the plus side, proudly LGBT. On the minus side, he showed some of the traits that he would show later on as Jack the Ripper. One thing we know about Tumblety is he loved the theatre. He was a regular visitor to theatres across North America. And of course, theatres were meeting places for men of a certain persuasion who could hook up and form relationships or just have a one-night stand. People like Walt Whitman would have been regulars in the theatre as well for the same reason. But Tumblety undoubtedly came to the theatre here in Toronto, Hamilton, and in other Canadian cities to watch the play, but also to have some fun. Theatres were bawdy and licentious, and so was Tumblety. He didn't keep his sexuality a secret. Even though the term homosexual hadn't been popularised by the emerging science of psychology, Tumblety's preference for young men was recognised regardless. Coming through a part of Toronto like this, with late 19th century houses, quite middle class, quite suburban, you get an idea of the kind of housing that Tumblety might have lived in, because he liked the fine things of life, although he normally lived in hotels. But when he did have an apartment, it would have probably been in a fairly swanky part of Toronto. So much of old Toronto doesn't exist anymore. Like most American cities, it's transforming all the time. But this building behind me here was built in 1857 when Tumblety was in Toronto, we know in the 1850s, conducting his nefarious medical business. In every city where he operated, Tumblety filled the newspaper classified advertisement columns with promotional material about himself. He really was a consummate showman. If anywhere evokes the Toronto of Tumblety's time, it's here in the distillery district, where a lot of 19th century Toronto first was left to decay and now has been revived as bars and restaurants. But these buildings that you can see behind me do date back to Tumblety's time. It's here in Canada that we get the first hint of who and what Francis Tumblety is when he commits an alleged manslaughter in St. John. The death of one of his patients led to Tumblety being put on trial, but astonishingly, he fled on horseback and jumped the border into the United States. One journalist looked into Tumblety's financial affairs in Toronto and found that he had something like $60,000 in the bank in the 1850s. Now, that's a big sum of money, 6-7 figure sum of money. Tumblety was also accused of trying to perform an illegal abortion in Montreal. The Montreal abortion case was a very close shave for Tumblety. It went to court, but using his Irish networks, he managed to win the day. But there's no doubt he had broken the law, as he would do many times. What I've been trying to get to grips with is how Tumblety used, if you want, Irish and gay networks in 19th century Canada and the United States to protect himself, essentially, because he often drew on the support of police officers, senior police officers, mayors, politicians, business people, and so on, when he got into trouble. I mean, I think it's how he avoided prison on the various charges that he faced for gross indecency and for fraud. So it's very fascinating to know how that happened. It's something I'm still investigating. But there were undoubtedly very potent Irish and gay networks here in cities like Toronto. Just imagine that this very street behind me here, Jack the Ripper could have walked down this street, Francis Tumblety, before being arrested by Scotland Yard in London in 1888. So now I'm in Hamilton, Ontario, just down the road from Toronto, where we know that Francis Tumblety was here in the 1850s. And there was an incident, in fact, where he was using the brother of an Irish chambermaid as his valet and did a kind of public performance where he'd give a painkiller to this valet to show how effective his treatments were. In fact, I think he then removed a tooth, or pretended to remove a tooth, from the valet. Anyway, he gave the painkiller to this Irish chambermaid's brother, who was acting as his valet, and the young kid went into convulsions. The Irish chambermaid, who apparently was well versed in the Queensberry rules, then gave Tumblety a good beating. And he became the laughing stock, apparently, of Hamilton, Ontario, where I am now, and had to leave town rather quickly. So I'm on Lock Street in Hamilton, and who knows, Tumblety may have walked down this street, though not about to eat the burger that I'm set to order. But nevertheless, his time here was cut short by yet another scandal, and off he went to yet another city.